Welcome to Sayers and Secrets, where every silence hides a story. Tonight, at a winter ball of glitter and shadows, a blonde guest carries secrets that may shatter the night, and only Nero Wolfe can untangle the truth. Suppose mysteries cloaked in shadow intrigue you like this video, and subscribe to join the investigation. Now light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. I don't usually let winter get the best of me. A man can stand a little cold, provided the steam pipes at home keep rattling like an honest drunk and there's a decent roast waiting at dinner time. But that January evening had the kind of bite that made even my coat feel like tissue paper. The streets were crusted with snow and the air tasted like iron. I was glad to push open the door of the brownstone and let the warmth swallow me up. Fritz had a kettle singing in the kitchen, and the smell of cinnamon floated faintly in the air. His idea of cheering up a house that had the personality of a monastery when Wolfe wasn't talking. Wolfe himself was upstairs with the orchids, which meant I had an hour before I'd hear his weight shifting onto the office chair that creaked like a confession. Peace, in short. Except peace never lasts long around here. Not when people with more money than sense decide they need Nero Wolfe's brain. The first hint came in the form of a single white glove, silk, damp with melting snow. I found it lying just inside the vestibule, next to the umbrella stand, like a lost calling card from somebody who wasn't good at subtlety. It was slim, delicate, and carried a faint trace of perfume. Lilac, maybe. The kind that clings to ballrooms and borrowed kisses. "Fritz," I called, holding it up. "You expecting a visitor from a Vienna operetta?" Before he could answer, the door swung open again, and the glove's mate walked in, wearing a pale fur wrap and diamonds that would have made Tiffany's accountant choke. She was tall, blonde, and the sort of woman who didn't come knocking at our door unless life had gone spectacularly sideways. Her lipstick was the colour of a winter rose, and her eyes looked around the brownstone with the polite terror of someone who realizes she's invaded a lion's den and isn't sure if the lion is hungry. "I need to speak to Mr. Wolfe," she said. Her voice was low, steady, but she held her wrap close as if to shield herself from something colder than January. I gestured toward the office. "You and everybody else." "He's with his orchids." "You'll have to wait until he descends from the mountain top." Her lips curved faintly. "And you are?" "The janitor," I said. "On Tuesdays, I sweep. On Thursdays, I do impressions of the great Nero Wolfe to keep the clients amused. On Fridays, I run his errands in the snow, sit down before your heels, scratch the rug." She sat carefully, like someone lowering herself into a bath that might be too hot. I took the chair opposite, leaned back, and looked at her. "You're coming from somewhere fancy," I said. "That perfume hasn't seen a grocery store aisle. The glove, the wrap, the ice on your wrist. That's not Woolworth's. But it's the eyes that give you away. You've been somewhere loud, bright, and full of music. A winter ball, maybe?" Her surprise flickered, then steadied. "Yes. The winter charity ball at the Larchmont Hotel, and you left in such a hurry you dropped a glove in our vestibule." She didn't bother to deny it. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her hands on her lap, and the diamonds winked at me like they had secrets. "Mr. Wolfe is my only chance. Please tell him that Cecilia Vane requests his help." Names don't usually mean much until Wolfe nods over them, but hers rang a faint bell. Society pages, maybe, or one of those charity photographs with champagne glasses raised. I filed it away. Wolfe came in a few minutes later, the sound of his tread slow, deliberate, the kind that suggested stairs existed solely to make him angry. He entered the office in his usual brown suit, expression set in the kind of neutrality that could freeze lava. His eyes landed on the blonde, and he stopped. Not in surprise. Wolfe didn't do surprise, but in the way a general pauses before rearranging troops. "Good evening, madam," he said, moving to his chair and settling in as if gravity had been invented for his personal use. "You have intruded upon my schedule." I dislike that Cecilia Vane inclined her head. "Forgive me. I was told you never leave this house, so I came here directly." "That is a half-truth," Wolfe said. "I leave for meals only under duress, and for other matters under threats more severe. Why are you here?" I watched her inhale, steady herself. "Because someone means to ruin me. And I don't know who." Now, I've heard variations of that line enough times to start a scrapbook, but the way she said it carried the weight of more than gossip or blackmail. She looked at Wolfe like a sinner looks at a priest who might decide whether she burns. Wolfe shut his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "Explain." She told us. Not in a rush, but in careful strokes. At the winter charity ball, someone had slipped an envelope into her purse. Inside was a photograph of her. Not recent, but damaging if it reached the wrong hands. Alongside the photo, a note. "Pay before midnight, or the world learns what you were once willing to forget." "Blackmail," I muttered. "Worse," she said. "Because I don't know if it is money they want, or silence. And I don't know who they are." But they were at that ball tonight. Watching her hands, trembled slightly as she set the envelope on Wolfe's desk. I leaned in, curious, but Wolfe gestured sharply and I leaned back. He picked up the envelope with the tips of his fingers as though it might contaminate him. Archie Goodwin may be many things. Secretary, errand boy, chauffeur, wit for hire. But even I can recognize when something dangerous has walked in. The photograph showed a younger Cecilia, smiling at some man whose face had been torn away, leaving only the jagged edge of paper. The note was typed, anonymous. Wolfe laid the photo down and steepled his fingers. "You attended this ball?" Who else was present? She listed names. Patrons, industrialists, a retired judge, an opera singer with a temper. It was a roll call of people with enough money and vanity to drown in champagne. And each name, I noticed, made her voice tighten slightly, as if the mere syllables pressed against her throat. "All," Wolfe said finally. "A circle of suspects before I have even consented to the case." "Unsavory." Cecilia leaned forward. "Mr. Wolfe, I beg you. I cannot go to the police. This matter, if it spreads, will destroy me." He closed his eyes again, as if the very concept of her desperation was another tax on his patience. Then he opened them and looked at me. "Archie." "Yeah?" "Bring her brandy." That meant he was considering it. Wolfe never lubricated the frightened unless he intended to wring them dry later. I fetched the brandy, handed it to her, and watched her sip. Wolfe's eyes were on her the entire time, not with desire. Wolfe's desires began and ended with food and orchids, but with calculation. "We shall see," he said finally. "For now you will leave the photograph and the note. Tomorrow Mr. Goodwin will call upon you. You will provide a list of those with reason to wound you, real or imagined." Relief flooded her face, though it barely cracked her composure. She rose, thanked him, and left, the fur wrap brushing the air with perfume and snow. The brownstone was silent again. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closed, fingers resting on his middle. "Well?" I asked. "She is not lying," Wolfe said, "Eddie, but she is not telling the whole truth." I grinned. That's what keeps us in business. Outside, the snow kept falling, as quiet and merciless as suspicion. The brownstone had swallowed stranger stories than Cecilia Vane's, but that didn't make this one easier to digest. After she left, Wolfe stayed silent long enough to convince me he was meditating on the mysteries of digestion rather than blackmail. I've seen him handle half a cow for dinner with more urgency than he showed that envelope. He let it rest on the corner of his desk like it was a newspaper insert he'd already decided not to read. Finally, he shifted one finger and said, "Archie." "Yes, sir?" "Catalogue her." That was Wolfe speak for "give me your impressions while they're still warm." He trusted my eyes even if he thought my tongue ran ahead of my brain. "Well," I began, "Cecilia Vane is the kind of blonde who knows what every inch of her reflection looks like before she steps out the door. She's got the polish of money, but the nerves of somebody watching the floor drop beneath her heels. The fur wrap wasn't for warmth, it was for armor. The perfume was expensive, but not new. She's worried about other things and didn't bother replacing the bottle. And those diamonds were either insurance or bait. Hard to tell which Wolfe's lips pressed together, which for him was a round of applause. And her words? She was steady until she had to say the part about not knowing who wanted her ruined. That hit harder than she expected, so either she's not used to being blindsided, or she's not used to telling the truth. "My bet is both," Wolfe grunted. "Adequate. Tomorrow you will see her. Secure the list." "Of course." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "But you know what this smells like, don't you?" Blackmail means scandal, and scandal means a crowd of suspects who all claim to be shocked by it. "This is going to get noisy," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "Noise is your province. Mine is meaning." That was my cue to shut up, so I did. The next morning, after Wolfe's customary breakfast ritual, eggs cooked to the second, coffee brewed to the standard of a pope's blessing, I headed out to meet Cecilia Vane at her apartment. The snow had turned the sidewalks into a carnival of slips and curses, but I got there with only one near fall and the loss of some shoe polish. Cecilia's building was the kind that had a doorman who'd memorized every face within a 3-block radius. He gave me the once-over like I was there to deliver a package that might explode, then finally buzzed me up. She received me in a living room that was more museum than home. Glass-topped tables, heavy drapes, photographs in silver frames arranged as if they'd been measured by a compass. But the neatness was betrayed by one thing: a cut glass tumbler on the sideboard, still half full of what looked like whiskey, and a faint indentation in the sofa cushion that suggested she hadn't slept much. She wore a pale blue dress now, daytime armor, but her eyes were red at the edges. "You came," she said simply. "I'm reliable." "Ask anybody. You have the list?" She handed me a folded sheet of paper. I didn't open it right away, just tucked it into my pocket. I prefer to read suspects' names with Wolfe's eyebrows in the room, not alone in somebody's parlor. "Tell me something," I said. "That photograph, when was it taken?" She hesitated, then moved to the window, looking out at the dull winter sky. 8 years ago. I was in Europe. It was a careless time. I thought those memories were buried, and the man whose face was torn away." Her shoulders stiffened. "Someone who must remain buried." That was as far as she was willing to go, so I switched lanes. "At the ball last night, did you notice anyone paying particular attention to you?" Her eyes darted, remembering. 3 people. Judge Harlan, though, always looks at everyone, as if weighing their sins. Marcus Lyle, the steel magnate, he wanted to discuss an investment, but I avoided him. And Margot Channing, the opera singer, she has a talent for seeing too much friends or enemies. "Both," she said. "In that circle, the line blurs." I left her with a reminder that Wolfe would be in touch, and went back out into the cold with the list burning a hole in my pocket. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with his lips pressed into a thin line of irritation. "You're late." "I stopped to avoid getting killed by taxi drivers with sledges for tires," I said, dropping the folded paper onto his desk. He opened it delicately, eyes moving down the names. As expected, a circle of parasites and predators. I leaned against the desk. "Parasites and predators make good business for us. Who do we start with?" Wolfe tapped the list with one finger. "Marcus Lyle. His fortune is iron, but his reputation is rust. Interview him?" I sighed. "Fine. But you owe me hazard pay if he throws steel girders." The interview was scheduled for late afternoon at Lyle's office, which occupied half a floor in a skyscraper that smelled of oil and ambition. Lyle himself was a thick-set man with a jaw like an anvil and eyes that looked for angles the way a hawk looks for rabbits. "Miss Vane is a friend," I began, taking a seat across from him. "She believes someone at the ball last night wants her ruined." "Your name came up," he barked a laugh. "Of course it did." Cecilia Vane has always liked to point her finger away from herself. But let me tell you something, Goodwin. If she's being blackmailed, it isn't me. I've no need to extort money when I own half the steel in this city. And as for her secrets... He leaned forward, voice dropping. "Everyone in that ballroom has secrets. Some are cheaper than others." It wasn't a denial so much as an advertisement. But I left with enough to feed Wolfe's appetite. By the time I got back, dusk had settled, and the brownstone's windows glowed like beacons. Inside, Wolfe was reading, his lips moving slightly as if savouring every syllable. I reported, giving him the gist of Lyle's performance. "Predictable," Wolfe said. "What of the others?" "Tomorrow," I said. "Unless you want me to interview all of Manhattan before dinner." Wolfe's glare suggested he might actually consider it, but then Fritz appeared in the doorway, with news of duck roasting in the oven, and the detective's priorities realigned. As we sat down to dinner, Wolfe finally spoke again, more to himself than me. "The torn photograph is the fulcrum. Until I know who was cut away, the lever cannot move." I raised my glass. "Then here's to fulcrums. May they show themselves before someone decides to deliver another envelope." Wolfe didn't toast. He never did. But his silence had its own weight, and I had the uneasy sense that the next envelope might not just hold a photograph. Wolfe never needed to raise his voice to make me work. The duck had barely cooled on my plate when he started issuing commands with that half-closed eye look that told me he was already 2 steps ahead of whatever idea I thought I was having. Marcus Lyle was predictable, he said, but the others needed vetting before he would risk drawing conclusions, which meant I was back out on the icy streets while he let orchids and digestion occupy his energy. The next morning was one of those that made you wish you'd been born in Florida. The sky was the color of pewter, and the wind whipped down the avenues like it had a grudge. I fortified myself with Fritz's coffee and a cinnamon roll that should have been served under lock and key, then headed to pay a call on Judge Harlan. Harlan had retired from the bench, but not from the habits of authority. He lived in a townhouse lined with books he probably hadn't cracked in years, but liked to display as evidence of his wisdom. He wore a robe, not the judicial kind, but the sort wealthy men favor when they want to look distinguished without actually trying. His handshake was dry, his eyes sharp. "I understand you are investigating some private matter," he said after I'd introduced myself. "Concerning Miss Vane?" "That's the rumor," I said. "She seems to think somebody at the winter ball wanted to spoil her evening." "You were there?" "I was." He folded his hands like he was still passing sentence. "Miss Vane is admired, but not universally. She cultivates admiration as if it were a rose garden, but roses have thorns, I observed her conversing with several gentlemen and one or two ladies in a manner that might stir resentment. Such as? His gaze rested on me like I was a witness he wanted to trip up. Marcus Lyle, certainly. Their conversation ended abruptly, and Margot Channing, though women's rivalries are not easily weighed in a court of law. I also noticed a man I did not recognize. He lingered near her table, said little, but watched closely. Perhaps someone from her past that perked my ears. Could you describe him? Medium height, dark hair, a scar on the left cheek. He left before midnight, I wrote it down. A scarred man doesn't just blend into a crowd. When I asked if the judge himself had any reason to see Cecilia ruined, he smiled thinly. Young man, I have judged murderers and thieves. If I wished a woman ruined, she would be. But Miss Vane and I have no quarrel. It wasn't exactly exoneration, but it was delivered with enough gravitas to keep me from pressing harder. I left him to his books and his robe and turned my steps toward Margot Channing's apartment. The opera singer lived like her life was a stage set. Even before I rang the bell, I heard scales rising and falling behind the door, the kind that can crack glass if you don't brace yourself. When she appeared, she was wrapped in a silk dressing gown that shimmered like it had been borrowed from a costume trunk. "Miss Vane?" she repeated after I laid out my errand. Ah, yes, she was at the ball, looking very fine indeed, but troubled. I saw her slip away to the powder room more than once. When she returned, her smile was brittle, like porcelain. I told her she mustn't worry so much, but Cecilia has always been the type to imagine shadows. Somebody slipped her an envelope, I said. That's not imagination. Her painted eyebrows lifted. Then she has real enemies. I do not count myself among them. Cecilia and I compete, yes, but only on the stage of society. If I wanted to wound her, I would do it in the open, with applause. That fit with her reputation, dramatic, proud, but not the type to whisper from behind a curtain. Still, I noticed her eyes flickered when I mentioned Marcus Lyle, as though some memory passed behind them. I made a note. By the time I trudged back to the brownstone, my shoes had soaked through and my temper wasn't far behind. Wolfe was in his chair, sipping beer like a man who had never known the hardship of wet socks. I gave him the rundown, Judge Harlan's mystery man, Margot Channing's brittle observations. Wolfe's lids lowered, which meant the gears were spinning. The judge's testimony is of interest. The scarred man, if he exists, may hold the thread or he may be a ghost of Harlan's imagination, I countered. Judges do not imagine scars. They dismiss or they condemn. We will find him. I was about to ask how when Fritz entered, looking uneasy, which was unusual. Fritz could carry in a bomb and still ask if I wanted sauce with it. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "someone has been in the kitchen. The spice cabinet. It has been rearranged." I blinked. "Rearranged?" "Yes, my jars are always in precise order. Today the nutmeg and the clove have changed places, and the jar of paprika had been opened, though I did not open it." I looked at Wolfe. He had gone still, heavier than usual, which was saying something. His eyes opened, sharp as blades. "This is intolerable," he said. "Someone has trespassed." It might have sounded ridiculous to anyone else, getting worked up over spices. But I knew better. The brownstone was Wolfe's temple, inviolate. For someone to tamper with Fritz's domain meant they had reached into the heart of Wolfe's fortress. "Lock the doors," Wolfe said. "And Archie, see if anything else has been disturbed." I made a sweep. No broken windows, no forced entries. But in the office, one of Wolfe's books was shifted slightly on the shelf, as though a hand had slid it out and put it back too quickly. I reported this, and Wolfe's scowl deepened. "They probe," he said softly. "They wish to show they can touch me." It was the first time in years I'd heard something like unease in his voice. That night was tense. Wolfe stayed in the office longer than usual, his eyes half closed, his lips barely moving as if rehearsing possibilities. I kept watch, listening for sounds outside that never came. The city roared, but the brownstone held its breath. When morning came, Wolfe announced we were not waiting for the scarred man to find us. "Saul Panzer," he said. "Call him. He will watch the approaches. Whoever entered once may enter." Again, I phoned Saul, who took the assignment with his usual calm efficiency. If someone so much as touched our doorknob wrong, Saul would know it before their fingers left prints. Meanwhile, Wolfe turned back to Cecilia's list, pointing at 2 more names. We proceed. Miss Vane's enemies will declare themselves by pressure. The photograph was bait. The intrusion confirms it. They mean to unnerve, I couldn't argue. They were doing a good job of unnerving me. As I left the house to follow Wolfe's orders, snowflakes were beginning to fall again, softer this time, muffling the world. I had the sense that the city was closing in, that whoever had switched the jars of paprika and nutmeg was already a step ahead. And somewhere, the scarred man with the quiet eyes might be waiting in the snow, ready to make his move. When Saul Panzer takes a case, you can assume the streets of New York suddenly sprout eyes sharper than any cop could afford. By the time I'd poured my second cup of coffee that morning, Saul had already stationed himself with the quiet efficiency of a man who could blend into a wallpaper pattern and still overhear the termites talking. If anyone tried another paprika stunt in the brownstone, they'd walk right into Saul's shadow. Wolfe, meanwhile, sat in his chair like a mountain, deciding whether to shift. He had the list of names before him, Cecilia's neat handwriting, staring up from the page, and he regarded it as if it were a chessboard where every pawn thought itself a queen. He spoke without opening his eyes. The scarred man is not an invention. Judges invent nothing. He is either a spectre from Miss Vane's past or the current agent of her humiliation. Either way, he must be identified. That narrows it down to half the men in New York with bad luck in knife fights, I said. You will find him. So I did what I always do, put my hat on, checked my gun, and went out into the city to fish for a face with a scar. The judge had said the man left the ball before midnight. That meant he had been there long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be remembered by everyone else. I started at the Larchmont Hotel, where the winter charity ball had been held, and sweet-talked the night clerk into letting me look at the guest log. Cecilia Vane's name was there, written in the precise hand of someone who knew people would study it later. Harlan, Lyle, Channing, present and accounted for. And tucked among the signatures was one that snagged me. Henry R. Felsen. The name alone meant nothing, but the clerk remembered him. "Quiet fellow," he said. "Didn't mingle much. Had a mark on his cheek, like he'd cut himself shaving, only deeper. That was enough to make me lean in. Did he leave early?" The clerk nodded. "Yes, sir. Close to midnight." Seemed in a hurry, I slipped him a bill and left with the name ringing in my head. Felsen wasn't a big wheel in society, no magnate, no patron of the arts, but he'd been close enough to Cecilia to drop into her orbit. If he was the one slipping photographs, it was time to find out why. Tracking him wasn't hard. A phone call to Long Cohen at the Gazette got me his address, a boarding house near Gramercy Park. Cohen didn't even ask why. By now, he knew Wolfe's name was worth more than a headline. The boarding house was respectable in that faded way that suggests respectability is the only thing left holding up the walls. The landlady let me in after I claimed to be an old acquaintance. Felson's room was at the end of the hall on the 3rd floor. When I knocked, the door creaked open with no answer. Inside, the room smelled of dust and tobacco. The bed was unmade, the kind of unmade that says nobody plans on coming back to tuck it in. On the desk was a half-burned cigarette still in the tray, cold, and next to it another photograph of Cecilia Vane, younger, smiling, with the same torn edge where a man's face had been cut away. I didn't touch it, just stood there a moment listening. The floorboards in the hall creaked. Someone had been waiting for me to go in. I spun just in time to see a shadow vanish down the stairs. By the time I gave chase, the street was empty, except for a delivery truck grinding its way uptown. Either I'd been tailed, or Felson had friends who didn't like visitors. I grabbed the photo anyway, and got back to the brownstone. Wolfe took one look at it, and his brows drew together. 2 copies of the same photograph. This is no ordinary blackmail. It is fixation obsession, you mean? Yes, the torn-away man is the key. Miss Vane believes him buried, but his ghost walks. He closed his eyes, thinking. I paced, because somebody had to keep the room from turning into a tomb. Saul came in just before dinner, reporting no disturbances, no strange cars, no men loitering near the brownstone. But his tone was taut, the way Saul gets when he senses the quiet before a break. That break came sooner than I liked. Around 8, the phone rang. Fritz answered, then carried the receiver to Wolfe with a look that said, this call wasn't about groceries. Wolfe listened, said nothing for a long moment, then replaced the receiver with exaggerated care. That was Miss Vane, he said. She is distraught. Another envelope has arrived. I felt the air in the room tightened. What was in it? Not a photograph? A key. A key to what? She does not know. She will bring it here tomorrow morning. That night, Wolfe was restless. He paced the office, well, his version of pacing, which meant taking 6 slow steps and lowering himself into the chair again with the groan of a man whose bones protested every ounce. I could tell he hated it. Whoever was behind this had not only touched the brownstone, but had now invaded Wolfe's sense of control. Before bed, I checked the locks twice. Saul kept watch outside, but my gut told me the enemy wasn't interested in breaking windows. They were playing a longer game, sliding keys and photographs like pawns across a board we couldn't yet see. The morning came grey and brittle. Cecilia arrived looking paler than before, as if the snow had bled into her skin. She handed Wolfe a small envelope. Inside was a brass key, old, with a tag tied to it by a string. No words, just the number 14 scratched into the metal. Wolfe turned it over in his palm. A key? But to what? A room? A box? A locker? The donor intends to lead us by increments. An irritation, Cecilia's voice cracked. I can't endure much more. Mr. Wolfe, you must stop this before everything is destroyed. He regarded her for a long time, then said, destruction is rarely total. Even ruin leaves residue. Tell me again about the man whose face you cut away. Her lips parted, then closed. She shook her head. No, he cannot be part of this. Wolfe's eyes glittered. He is the only part of this. I escorted her out, though she looked ready to collapse. When I came back, Wolfe had already set the key on his desk and was staring at it as though it might confess. Archie, he said. Yeah? Felson. Find him, I already tried. The room was empty. Try again. Harder. So I did. But as I pulled on my coat and headed out into the cold, I had the sense that the key with its little brass tag had already unlocked something. Not a door, not yet, but the next move in a game that was turning darker by the hour. Finding Henry R. Felsen wasn't going to be as easy as asking the nearest cabbie if he'd seen a man with a scar loitering around. If the room at the boarding house was abandoned, he'd already packed his baggage and probably left me his cigarette stubs as a love letter. Still, Wolfe had told me to find him, and Wolfe's orders aren't suggestions. I started by leaning on Lon Cohen again. A call to the Gazette's morgue department got me a thin folder with the name Felsen scrawled on it in the smudged handwriting of clerks who file lives like receipts. Not much there. He'd once worked as an accountant for a shipping firm, then drifted out of sight after some personal difficulties. Translation: he left before they could fire him. There was a whisper about debts and one reference to his spending time in Europe about 8 years ago. That made my ears perk up. 8 years ago also happened to be when Cecilia's photograph was taken. I took that little coincidence back to Wolfe, who received it with the kind of grunt that meant it wasn't a coincidence at all. Europe, he said, the same careless period Miss Vane preferred to glide over. Which means Felsen might not just be a stranger with a scar, I said. He could be the man in the missing half of the photograph. Possibly. Or he was adjacent to the man. Either way, he carries memory, and memory is being used as a weapon. That was Wolfe's way of saying I had to dig deeper. So I put my feet to the pavement. Felsen's old shipping firm was a dreary warehouse outfit near the docks. The manager, a man with oil on his hands and suspicion in his eyes, remembered Felsen only vaguely. Kept to himself, he said. Figures in neat columns, no talk. I heard he gambled. Cards, mostly. Then one day, he just didn't show up. Good riddance that fits with the debt rumour. A gambler, a man who vanished, now surfacing with a key and photographs. He didn't smell like a mastermind, more like a pawn somebody had nudged forward. But pawns are useful when you want to test the defences. I checked a few card rooms uptown. At the third one, a waiter who owed me a favour swore he'd seen Felsen a week ago. He kept to the back table, didn't play heavy. Lost a little, won a little, then left. Always had that scar shining under the light. Hard to miss, so Felsen was alive, mobile and circling the city. But he wasn't making himself too easy to grab. I returned, late, shoes soaking again, and gave Wolfe the report. He sat there chewing on the facts like Fritz's duck bones. Felsen may not come to us voluntarily, he said finally. But if he has debts, we can pull the string. He had me call Saul again. By nightfall, Saul was moving through the card rooms, unobtrusive as a shadow. If Felsen popped up, Saul would find him. Meanwhile, Wolfe turned his mind back to the brass key. It sat on his desk like an accusation. I picked it up, turning it over. What if it's a hotel key? I asked. Perhaps. Or a locker. The donor intends us to ask questions. They want us to chase, and you hate being led. Intensely. Which is why we will not be led. We will intercept. That was his way of telling me he'd already thought 3 moves ahead. The next morning, the brownstone wasn't quiet. A letter arrived, hand-delivered, with Cecilia's name on the front but dropped in our box instead. Wolfe opened it with the tips of his fingers, eyes narrowing as he unfolded the single sheet inside. It read, "The key opens the past. Do not let Wolfe hold it. Meet me at midnight, Pier 14. No signature, just block letters from a typewriter ribbon that had seen better days. Pier 14. The docks, where Felsen had once worked." I looked at Wolfe. "Sounds like an invitation." "An invitation to folly," he said. "If Miss Vane receives it, she will be tempted." "You will go. Watch. Do not intervene. I want to know who believes themselves clever enough to summon that evening, bundled in enough layers to make me feel like an overstuffed mattress. I staked out Pier 14. The river lapped black against the pilings and the fog lay thick enough to slice. Midnight came, and so did Cecilia, her pale wrap pulled tight against the wind. She looked around, anxious, then clutched her bag as if it contained her spine. From the shadows a man stepped forward, scar on his cheek. Felsen. He moved toward her, but before he could speak, another figure emerged, a broad man in a heavy coat, face obscured. I held my breath, wishing Wolfe had let me pack something heavier than my usual revolver. The two men faced Cecilia, and for a moment I thought the pier would end in a scream. But instead the broad man pressed something into her hand, whispered, and then vanished into the fog. Felsen lingered only long enough to look back over his shoulder, straight at me, though he couldn't have seen through the dark. And then he too disappeared. Cecilia stood there, trembling, then hurried away. I didn't reveal myself. Wolfe had told me to watch, and Wolfe's orders are stone tablets. I followed her at a distance until she reached her car and left. Then I returned to the brownstone, my coat heavy with river damp, and my head heavier with questions. Wolfe listened without interruption, his eyes closed. When I finished, he said, "Describe the object." I couldn't see it. She shoved it into her bag too fast, but she has it now. Then tomorrow she will come here, and she will tell us, or we will extract it. Felsen looked like he wanted to say something, I added, but he didn't. The other man cut him off. That is telling. Felsen is subordinate. He's a piece, not the hand that moves it. I couldn't argue. What stuck with me most was the way Felsen had looked back, as though he knew Wolfe would be waiting, and that I was only the messenger. That night Wolfe didn't pace, but he didn't rest either. He sat in his chair, eyes closed, lips moving, as if holding a silent argument with himself. Fritz moved about quietly, polishing silver as if he, too, sensed the storm creeping closer. In the morning, Cecilia would arrive again, clutching whatever had been pressed into her hand on the pier. And Wolfe would begin tightening the noose he'd been weaving since the first glove touched our vestibule. Cecilia Vane returned to the brownstone the next morning, as if the night at Pier 14 had stolen whatever colour was left in her face. She moved like porcelain that had been dropped once too often, still intact, but rattling from the cracks. Fritz showed her in, his usual grace shadowed by worry. Even he could tell this woman was dragging something heavier than her fur wrap. She clutched her handbag as if it were carrying her heartbeat. Wolfe gestured toward the red leather chair opposite his desk, and she sank into it without a word. He waited, of course. Wolfe never asked first when silence might squeeze an answer free. Finally, she opened the bag and produced a small object wrapped in paper. She laid it on the desk with a hand that trembled just enough to ripple the edge. Wolfe peeled back the paper. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished but intact, engraved with a pattern of vines curling into letters, initials, faint but visible. H.R.F. Felsen, Wolfe said softly. Her eyes widened, as if the letters had only now admitted their identity. How did you— Do not insult me. This belongs to the scarred man. It was pressed into my hand last night, she whispered. By someone else. Not him, I leaned forward. The big man in the heavy coat. He gave it to you? Felsen just watched. She nodded. Yes. And then he looked at me with such accusation, as though I had done him some unspeakable wrong. Wolfe studied her like she was a specimen pinned to velvet. You had. Her lips trembled. No, I told you. Archie, Wolfe said, cutting her off. Describe Felsen's history. I pulled out the thin file I'd worked up. Ex-accountant, card player, debts, disappeared 8 years ago after a stretch in Europe, just about the time a photograph of you was taken with a man conveniently torn out of the frame. Cecilia flinched. Wolfe continued. That man was Felsen. You erased him from the picture, literally. Now he reappears with photographs, with keys, with relics of your past. You cannot claim coincidence. She looked down at her hands, knuckles white. It was, complicated. Henry Felsen was once close to me, in Europe. Before I married, he was charming, ambitious, but reckless. He drank, he gambled, and when I left him, when I chose to bury him, it was for my future, for survival. And so he was buried, Wolfe said, but not dead. You cut his face from the photograph, yet here he stands, scarred, determined to remind you that he exists. The key, the locket, tokens. He wishes to resurrect himself or destroy you in the process. Her eyes filled with something that wasn't quite tears. I thought he was gone forever. I thought I was free. Few are free, Wolfe murmured. Least of all from the past. He let the silence grow heavy, then leaned forward slightly, a monumental gesture, given the girth that usually held him anchored. This campaign is not merely Felsen's. He is a pawn. Someone else placed the key in your hand. Someone else tampered with my brownstone. Felsen's obsession is real, but it is being directed. That made Cecilia shiver. Directed by whom? That, Wolfe said, is the question you must help us answer. Who knew of your past with Felsen? Who knew enough to exploit it? She hesitated, but Wolfe's gaze pinned her until the words came. Margot Channing. She was in Europe then too. She saw us together once at a dinner. She laughed at him afterward, called him a provincial gambler. She never forgot. Wolfe's lips curved, not a smile exactly, but a tightening of satisfaction. Ah. I picked up the locket, turning it over. So Margot knew. And Margot was at the ball. And Margot is the kind of woman who likes an audience. Indeed, Wolfe said, but not alone. Marcus Lyle, too, has a motive. He seeks influence, leverage, perhaps wealth, from Miss Vane. And Judge Harlan, who noticed Felsen, why did he notice? Perhaps because he already knew him. The circle is tightening. Cecilia looked between us like a woman surrounded. Please, you must stop them. If the world learns of my past with Henry, it will destroy you, Wolfe finished. Yes, you have said so, but destruction is relative. What matters is who profits from it. That is where we shall look. After she left, Wolfe called Saul. The locket bears initials. Find whether Felsen attempted to pawn such an item in recent weeks. If he still possesses debts, he may have tried to sell it before using it as a weapon. Saul grunted agreement and hung up. Wolfe then turned to me. You will return to Miss Channing. Press her. She knows more than she admitted. That was how I found myself that afternoon at Margot Channing's apartment again. She welcomed me with the same theatrical flair, but her eyes darted when I mentioned Felsen's name. You remember him? I said. Of course, she said too quickly. A minor man. Insignificant funny, I said. He doesn't look insignificant when he's pressing tokens of the past into Cecilia's hands. Or when he's being shadowed by someone strong enough to direct him. Someone like you, perhaps? Her laugh rang sharp. Me! I sing, I perform. I do not send scarred men with trinkets. But her fingers twisted a ring around her hand, a nervous tick she hadn't shown before. I filed it away. Back at the brownstone, I reported everything. Wolfe closed his eyes, steepled his fingers, and murmured, Margot Channing remembers too well. Which means she is either guilty of instigating or guilty of fearing exposure. And Lyle? I asked. He remains a suspect. Power and money hunger create their own trails, but it is the spice cabinet I return to. Spice cabinet? Yes, the trespass. Whoever entered wished not merely to unsettle us, but to prove access. That was no whim. That was a demonstration, a message. I can touch even Nero Wolfe's domain. Only someone with audacity, with theatricality, would attempt such insolence. Miss Channing qualifies I didn't argue, he wasn't wrong, but the thought of someone toying with us inside the brownstone still crawled on my skin. Dinner came and went. Wolfe ate, though with less enthusiasm than usual. He hated being toyed with, and this case was all toys and shadows. When Saul called later, his report was brief but pointed. Felsen had indeed tried to pawn the locket weeks ago, but reclaimed it suddenly, as if someone had told him it was worth more as leverage than cash, that someone had to be in our circle, which meant the game was narrowing. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and delivered the line that settled the night. Tomorrow we tighten the net, we draw them closer. And then, Archie, we see who snaps first. The next morning started with Wolfe dictating his plan as if he were rearranging troops on a battlefield, except his army consisted of one legman, one freelance operative, and a cook who preferred cream sauces to combat. Wolfe wasn't worried. He never was. "Archie," he said after breakfast, "you will visit Marcus Lyle again. He is an opportunist. If he sees an advantage in pressing Miss Vane's ruin, he will betray himself under your questions. Emphasize the key, sure," I said. "But what do I tell him the key are for?" Opening a safe full of incriminating photographs. "Say nothing. Mention only that we have it. His reaction will be sufficient." "Fine." "And while I'm dodging girders, what are you doing?" "Considering Miss Channing. Her vanity is both her armor and her weakness. I will exploit it. Later she will be invited here." I didn't ask what he'd do with her when she arrived. Wolfe never spoiled his own theatre. Marcus Lyle's office looked even more metallic in the morning light, all steel beams and ambition polished into furniture. He greeted me with a smile that had the warmth of a coin fresh from the mint. "Back again?" he said. "Miss Vane must be very nervous." "She is," I said, sitting down, especially after receiving a key with the number 14 etched into it. That got him. The coin's smile flickered, then hardened. "Key? What key? You tell me. You're the expert on iron." He leaned back, lacing his thick fingers. "If you think Cecilia's troubles involve me, you're wasting your time. She's a pleasant ornament at society functions, but no more. Whoever is sending her keys and trinkets is playing games, dangerous ones. I have no need of them, but you know about them," I said. He hesitated, just long enough for me to count it. "I hear things," he said finally. "Nothing more." I stood. "If you hear anything else, let me know." Wolfe enjoys tidbits. He didn't see me out, which was fine. I prefer leaving under my own steam. But his reaction to the key told me Wolfe was right. Lyle knew more than he was admitting, and he was rattled by the thought that we had it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe sat exactly where I'd left him, as if gravity had decided to keep him pinned until the world corrected itself. I reported Lyle's reaction. "Expected," he murmured. "He either knows what the key opens or fears what others will think it opens. Both are useful. What about Channing?" "Call her. Tell her Nero Wolfe requires her presence this afternoon. She will come." She did. Margot Channing arrived in a cloud of perfume and bravado, her voice filling the office before Fritz had even closed the door behind her. She swept into the red chair like a prima donna hitting her cue. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "you summoned me?" "I am here. I trust this means you are near solving Cecilia's melodrama?" Wolfe regarded her with the placidity of a crocodile waiting for the right moment to snap. "Miss Channing, melodrama is your métier. I prefer clarity." "You knew of Henry Felsen. You saw him with Miss Vane in Europe." Her eyes narrowed, but she kept her tone airy. "Yes, he was unremarkable then, and more so now." "And yet," Wolfe said, "you remember him with extraordinary detail." enough to laugh at him, enough to file him away as a jest. Such observations linger. Her chin lifted. I observe everything. It is part of my craft indeed. Did you observe him at the winter ball? A pause, just a flicker, but Wolfe caught it. No, she said, too quickly. You did, Wolfe said flatly. And more, you knew what role he played. Perhaps you even encouraged it, she flared. Encouraged? Nonsense! Miss Channing, Wolfe's voice cut like a cleaver. You trespassed in my brownstone. You tampered with the spice cabinet, with my books. That was your error. You wished to prove audacity. You wished to show you could unsettle me as you unsettle Miss Vane. But you are no strategist. You are a performer. The stage demands flourish, and flourish betrayed you. She froze. For a moment her facade cracked, the opera mask slipping. Then she laughed, high and sharp. Mr. Wolfe, you are imaginative. Do you truly think I would sneak into your house to rearrange condiments? I do not think. I know. No man would bother. Only a woman whose life is an endless stage, who believes every gesture must be seen, would attempt such insolence. Her laughter faltered. You cannot prove it. Proof is a matter of patience. You will supply it yourself. Archie will escort you out. She left in a whirl of silk and indignation, but Wolfe's eyes followed her with grim satisfaction. She is implicated, he said after the door closed, but not alone. Felsen lacks strength. Channing supplies drama. Lyle supplies resources. Judge Harlan supplies perception. Together they form the circle. I frowned. You're saying all of them are in on it? Perhaps not all consciously. But the web touches each, and somewhere at its center lies the purpose. We must find it. That evening, Saul phoned in. He had trailed Felsen to a shabby hotel near the docks. The scarred man had checked in under his own name, but hadn't left for hours. Saul had knocked, got no answer, and suspected the room was empty. Felsen runs, Wolfe said when I relayed the report. He always runs. But he leaves tokens. The locket, the photographs, the key. These are not his inventions. They are planted, directed. The true instigator hides. Still we ate dinner in silence, except for Fritz's muttered complaints about paprika. Wolfe brooded, his fork moving mechanically, his eyes never leaving some invisible point above the table. Afterward, in the office, he said quietly, Tomorrow we escalate. We will summon them here, Miss Vane, Lyle, Channing, Harlan, and Felsen, if he can be fetched. We will force them into one room. The truth cannot hide among so many nerves. I lit a cigarette, watching him. He looked heavier than usual, weighed not by his bulk, but by the pressure of the game. He hated being toyed with, and someone had turned this case into a theatre of gestures. But Wolfe was patient, and patience, in his hands, was more lethal than any weapon. When I turned in that night, the brownstone was silent except for the ticking of the hall clock. Outside, the snow was falling again, layering the city in white, hiding footprints, disguising tracks. Somewhere out there, Felsen or Channing or Lyle or whoever was pulling their strings was waiting for Wolfe to make his move. The move was coming. Wolfe always played the long game. And tomorrow the stage would shift from their ballrooms and docks to his office, where no gesture, no scar, no key could escape his eye. The next morning, the brownstone was busier than a tax office in April. Wolfe might loathe disorder, but when he decided to assemble suspects, the place turned into Grand Central with nerves instead of trains. Fritz polished the silver with unusual vigor, muttering in German about too many footsteps on his rugs. Saul checked in by phone, confirming he had eyes on Felsen's shabby hotel. "He hasn't bolted yet," Saul reported. "If you want him, I'll bring him." Wolfe's answer was a single syllable. Yes. That meant Saul would fetch our scarred friend whether he liked it or not. By noon, invitations had been delivered with Wolfe's name etched into them like a summons from Olympus. Judge Harlan, Marcus Lyle, Margot Channing, and Cecilia Vane, all told to present themselves at 7 sharp. That gave me 6 hours to brace the office, stock cigars, and wonder which chandelier would crack first when Wolfe started tugging the strings. Wolfe himself spent the day marinating in silence. He sat in his chair, eyes closed, lips pursed, fingers steepled. To a stranger, it might have looked like he was napping. I knew better. He was lining up words like bullets in a chamber, ready to fire when the stage filled. At 6:30, the snow started falling again, thick and soft. By 7, the brownstone's doorbell rang, and the show began. First in was Judge Harlan, solemn as a tomb, his heavy coat shedding flakes onto Fritz's immaculate floor. He gave me a nod that suggested I was an insignificant witness to something only he could properly weigh. Next came Marcus Lyle, broad shoulders wrapped in wool, his breath carrying the metallic tang of cigars smoked too quickly. His eyes flicked around the office, cataloguing it like an ETF investor eyeing asset. Margot Channing arrived third, her perfume sweeping in ahead of her, her gown a little too dramatic for an evening without footlights. She smiled at me as if I were an audience member who hadn't applauded loudly enough at her last performance. Cecilia Vane followed, pale and brittle, clutching her handbag as if inside it lay her salvation, or her ruin. She glanced at the others but said nothing. Finally, Saul arrived with Henry Felsen in tow. The scar on his cheek was raw in the lamplight, his eyes hollowed by years of debts and disappointments. He looked at Cecilia once, and in that look you could read the ghost of 8 years buried alive. Wolfe cleared his throat, and the room went still. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you are here because Miss Vane has been made the target of a campaign. This campaign involves photographs, trinkets, and trespasses. It is intended to ruin her. I intend to prevent that." Harlan sniffed. "Oh, why should this concern you, Mr. Wolfe?" "Because my house has been violated," Wolfe said evenly. "And because my patience has been taxed." That settled that. When Wolfe's house gets disturbed, it becomes everyone's problem. He turned his gaze on Felsen. "You, sir? You were once attached to Miss Vane. You disappeared, scarred and indebted. Now you return, not with conversation, but with threats. Why?" Felsen swallowed, his voice low. "I didn't plan this." "I wanted her to see me, to remember, but I didn't send the envelopes. I didn't sneak into your house," Lyle scoffed. "Convenient. Blame phantoms." Wolfe shifted his eyes to him. "You protest too quickly, Mr. Lyle. You knew of the key before you should have. Your wealth does not purchase innocence," Lyle bristled. "Are you accusing me?" "I accuse no one. I observe. And I observed that your reaction betrayed familiarity." Margot Channing laughed, high and brittle. "Mr. Wolfe, this is absurd. We are gathered like children for a parlour game. Cecilia's little scandal is not worth our time." "Then why trespass?" Wolfe asked calmly. "Why enter my brownstone to rearrange what was mine?" "A petty gesture, Miss Channing, but one that told me you wished to demonstrate audacity. Only you would stoop to theatrical insolence." Her painted smile froze. "You have no proof." "Proof accumulates," Wolfe said. "It clings like snow on a coat." "You will supply the final flake yourself." The judge cleared his throat. "If I may, this is becoming a spectacle. Miss Vane's reputation—" "Silence," Wolfe said, and the word landed like a gavel. "You, Judge, saw Felsen at the ball. You noted his scar, his departure. Why? Because you already knew him. You recognized him. That recognition suggests prior acquaintance. Harlan stiffened. I recognized him as a man who had once appeared in my courtroom. Petty theft dismissed. That is all. Wolfe's lids lowered. Convenient. But the pattern is clear. Each of you holds a piece. Felsen, the obsession. Miss Channing, the performance. Mr. Lyle, the resources. Judge Harlan, the perception. Together, you form the pressure. But the architect remains hidden. The silence that followed was thick. Cecilia sat with her hands clenched in her lap, eyes darting between them. Felsen's breathing was heavy, like a man fighting to keep his composure. Lyle glared, Channing bristled, Harlan pursed his lips. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. The next move will reveal the architect, and I will see it. That was the end of Act 1. He dismissed them, one by one, leaving them to stew in the suspicion he had ladled out like broth. Cecilia lingered, but Wolfe waved her away with surprising gentleness. When the door closed behind the last of them, I looked at him. So? Which one? Not yet, he murmured. Tonight was to rattle. Tomorrow will be to break. I shook my head. You sure know how to keep an audience on edge. But the audience is not you, it is them, and they are already trembling. Later, when I stepped outside to smoke, the snow was piling thick on the steps. Across the street, Saul stood under a lamp-post, collar up, eyes watchful. The suspects had scattered into the city, but the game was tightening. Whoever had orchestrated the campaign against Cecilia Vane had underestimated one thing. You can unsettle Nero Wolfe's brownstone. You can slip photographs into a purse and a locket into a hand. But once Wolfe calls you into his office, you're already caught. You just don't know how the net will close. When Wolfe said the next move would break them, he wasn't kidding. The brownstone had hosted its fair share of climaxes, crooks cornered, killers cornered, liars cornered. But this case had a way of circling like a snowstorm, throwing flakes of truth without ever settling. Wolfe meant to change that. The morning after our little parlour gathering, Wolfe summoned me with his usual trumpet call, Archie, and handed over a sheet of paper with names written in his heavy scrawl. Lyle, Channing, Harlan, Vane, Felsen. Same 5 players, but this time the instructions were sharper. You will visit each today, he said, in the order listed. You will deliver a message that tomorrow evening they are to attend again, but also, observe, each will betray themselves further, now that they know suspicion binds them. Sure, I said. I'll make the rounds like Santa Claus, except instead of toys, I'll be handing out paranoia. He ignored that. Note especially who presses you about the key. It remains the pivot. One of them knows precisely what it opens, and that knowledge is fatal to their defense. So off I went, hat tilted against the wind, making the city rounds with Wolfe's summons in my pocket. First stop was Marcus Lyle. His office was warmer this time, but only because his temper was running hot. He barely let me sit down before leaning forward. "What is Wolfe playing at?" he snapped. "Gathering us like schoolchildren, tossing accusations into the air. Does he expect us to sit meekly while he toys with reputations?" "Pretty much," I said. "And tomorrow night you get to sit some more." His jaw tightened. "And the key?" He mentioned it again. "What game is that?" I shrugged. "If you don't know, I can't help you. All I do is deliver messages." The way his eyes narrowed told me he knew something about that brass key, maybe more than anyone else on the list. I made a note of it before heading uptown. Margot Channing was next. She opened her door with a flourish as though she expected photographers behind me. She listened to the summons with mock impatience, then leaned against the doorframe. "Mr. Goodwin, tell me, Did Wolfe truly accuse me of sneaking into his kitchen to rearrange spices? Among other things. She laughed, a sharp trill. He's mad. I would never stoop so low. Then her eyes glinted. But I admit, the image of him fuming over paprika is delicious. He must have roared like a wounded lion. Her amusement was too practiced. She was hiding nerves under stage makeup, and I left her to them. Judge Harlan was cooler. He listened to my message, then folded his hands as though weighing it like evidence. "Wolfe is an able man," he said, "but I hope he remembers that accusations spoken in his office carry consequences outside it. A judge does not forget slander easily. You're retired," I pointed out. "I am still a judge," he said, with a dignity that smelled like mothballs. He asked nothing about the key, but his eyes followed me to the door, as if searching for it in my pockets. Cecilia Vane was waiting in her apartment, pale but steadier than before. She accepted Wolfe's summons like a woman accepting another blow. But then she surprised me. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "the key. Has Wolfe discovered what it opens?" I shook my head. "He hasn't told me if he has." Her lips pressed together. "It frightens me more than the photographs." "At least those I understand. But a key, a number, what if it leads to something I cannot control?" I gave her my best reassuring grin, but the truth was I had no more answers than she did. The last stop was Felsen. Saul had kept tabs on him at the shabby hotel, and the scarred man looked worse than the day before. He sat on the edge of his bed like he expected the floor to collapse. "Tomorrow," I told him. "Wolfe wants you again." Felsen's eyes darted. "I don't want to see them." "I don't want to face her. Not your choice," I said. "Wolfe insists." His voice cracked. "She left me. She cut me out like I was nothing. And now they use me. I'm not the one doing this. I swear it. Then tomorrow's your chance to prove it." When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, his eyes opening just enough to catch the weight of my report. "Lyle pressed about the key," I told him. "Vane too, though with fear rather than knowledge. Channing laughed too much. Harlan hid too well. And Felsen is cracking," Wolfe grunted. "As expected. The convergence nears. Tomorrow will suffice." That night Fritz served lamb, but Wolfe barely touched it. His appetite is usually a barometer of his certainty. A diminished plate meant the storm was close. After dinner he called Saul again, instructing him to tail Lyle this time. "Lyle is restless," Wolfe said. "Restlessness breeds indiscretion." By midnight Saul rang back with news. Lyle had met someone in a quiet bar downtown. Not Channing, not Harlan, not Felsen. Someone unnamed, cloaked, slipped him a folder before leaving. "What folder?" Wolfe asked. "Didn't see," Saul said, "but Lyle stuffed it in his coat like it was gold." When Wolfe hung up, his face was unreadable. He leaned back, eyes closed, and murmured, "Tomorrow, the storm breaks." I went to bed with the unease of a man who knows the pieces are moving, but not how the board looks. Outside, the snow kept falling, muffling the city, covering tracks even as new ones were made. Somewhere among our circle, the hand that had orchestrated Cecilia's torment was tightening the rope. Wolfe had set the trap. Tomorrow every suspect would walk back into the brownstone, into Wolfe's arena, where the truth would have nowhere left to hide. The next evening felt like waiting for a thunderstorm with no roof to stand under. Wolfe had set the time for 7 sharp again, and by 6:30 the brownstone was heavy with anticipation. Fritz moved quietly, polishing glasses that didn't need polishing. Saul called to confirm that Lyle had left his office with the same folder tucked under his arm. Wolfe listened, grunted, and told Saul to station himself nearby when the gathering began. "If Lyle flees," Wolfe said, "I want to know which alley he chooses." By 7 o'clock, the suspects were filing back into Wolfe's office, as if drawn by invisible chains. Harlan, solemn and irritable. Lyle, stiff and wary. Margot Channing, radiant but too brittle. Cecilia, pale and taut. And finally, Felsen, dragged in again by Saul, with the look of a man trapped between confession and collapse. Wolfe greeted none of them. He simply gestured toward the chairs, his own bulk settling behind the desk, like a mountain watching a valley quake. He waited until the silence became unbearable. Then, in a voice that cut through it like a blade, he said, "We have indulged in tokens long enough. Photographs, a key, a locket, each calculated to unnerve. Tonight we move from performance to substance. I will not permit further trespass, either upon Miss Vane or upon me." He fixed his gaze on Lyle. "Mr. Lyle, you received a folder last night. From whom?" Lyle's face darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Saul Panzer observed,
"You do not insult me with denials. Produce it." Lyle shifted in his chair. His hand moved toward his coat pocket, then stopped. His eyes flicked around the room, measuring his allies, his enemies. Finally, with a grunt, he drew out the folder and laid it on Wolfe's desk. I picked it up, opened it, and whistled low. Inside were bank records, letters and receipts, every one of them tying Felsen to gambling debts and European indiscretions. And everyone stamped with Cecilia Vane's name in the margins, as if someone had gone to the trouble of cross-referencing her life with his. "Interesting," Wolfe murmured. "You are not the architect, Mr. Lyle. You are the banker. Someone supplied you with these documents, and you carried them like a coin." "Who?" Lyle's mouth twisted. "A man has to protect himself. If Cecilia Vane's past becomes public, fortunes shift, investments change. I had to know where the cracks were." "You had to profit," Wolfe said coolly. "But you are still not the instigator. That role belongs elsewhere." He turned his head toward Margot Channing. "Miss Channing, you laughed at Felsen once, in Europe. You mocked him. You remembered him in detail when others forgot. You trespassed in my house to prove you could. You are a performer, but are you also the director?" Her chin lifted. "Director? Number, I observe, I amuse, I survive. But orchestrate, that is beyond me." Wolfe leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "You lie. The spice cabinet betrayed you. Only you would dare such theatrics, and yet even you are not sufficient. You would perform but not construct. The architecture requires precision." He swiveled his gaze to Harlan, who stiffened under it. "Judge. You alone noticed Felsen's scar. You alone recognized him in a crowd where others saw nothing. Why? Because you knew where to look. You had judged him before. And you saw utility in his obsession. Did you guide him? Did you whisper that he could reclaim what was cut away?" Harlan's face turned red. "This is outrageous." "I recognized him, yes, but nothing more," Wolfe said, dismissing him with a flick of his hand. "You are a spectator, not an architect. You prefer to weigh guilt after the fact, not shape it. No, our architect is elsewhere." All eyes turned to Cecilia then, though she hadn't spoken. She looked stricken, her hands clutched tight in her lap. Wolfe regarded her with unexpected gentleness. "Miss Vane," he said, "you believed you buried your past. You believed Felsen was gone, but someone close to you revived him. Someone who knew your fear would paralyze you. That someone has manipulated Felsen's fixation, Lyle's greed, Channing's vanity, and Harlan's judgment. Who benefits most from your ruin?" Her lips trembled. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," Wolfe said. His voice was soft, but inexorable. "Think. Who among your circle despises you enough to weave this web? Who has both the knowledge of your past and the will to resurrect it?" She closed her eyes as if the truth itself were poison. When she opened them, tears spilled. "Margot," she whispered. "It must be Margot. She always mocked me. She always wanted me diminished." Channing sprang up, eyes blazing. "Lies! I never—" Wolfe raised a hand, silencing her. "Not yet. Tomorrow, we conclude. Tonight I have heard enough. Leave now, all of you. Tomorrow evening you will return, and then the truth will be delivered." One by one they filed out, Cecilia trembling, Felsen hunched, Lyle muttering curses, Harlan stiff as a statue, Channing fuming like a diva denied her aria. When the last door shut, I looked at Wolfe. "So it's Margot?" He shook his head. "Perhaps, but perhaps not. Miss Vane's accusation is emotional, not logical. Tomorrow we sift logic. Tonight we let them stew." I lit a cigarette, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "And if they don't come back tomorrow?" "They will," Wolfe said simply. "Guilt and fear compel attendance, and greed and pride. Tomorrow, Archie, we close the net." The office went quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hiss of the radiator. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the city in white silence, as if the world itself were waiting for Wolfe's verdict. The following evening felt like the longest fuse on the shortest stick of dynamite. Wolfe had set the hour for 7 sharp once again, and by 6, the brownstone was already thick with anticipation. Fritz moved around the kitchen like a man preparing a banquet for a firing squad, while I kept an eye on the door, half expecting one of our guests to bolt before the curtain rose. Wolfe, of course, sat in his chair, immovable as a cathedral, eyes closed, lips pressed, the very picture of a man who already knew the ending. They came on time, which told me Wolfe had been right. Guilt, fear, greed and pride would keep them from staying away. Harlan arrived first, dour as ever, his heavy coat glistening with melted snow. Lyle followed, his face tight, the folder from the night before nowhere in sight. Margot Channing swept in with a burst of perfume and defiance, her gown as excessive as her temper. Cecilia Vane came after, pale, trembling, the weight of her handbag tugging her arm down. And finally, Saul delivered Felsen again, scar gleaming in the lamplight, his whole body vibrating with the tension of a man about to be dragged through fire. Wolfe didn't greet them. He let them take their seats. The office suddenly seemed smaller for the heat of so many conflicting hearts. Then he opened his eyes, slow and deliberate, and the room stilled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I will waste no more time. You have conspired, directly, indirectly, knowingly or not, to unsettle Miss Vane. The tokens, the trespasses, the key, the locket, all were meant to shake her. But the true architect of this campaign sits among us. Tonight, I expose them. You could feel the tension in the air like the moment before glass shatters." Wolfe gestured toward me. I opened the desk drawer and placed the brass key, the locket, and the photographs in front of him. They looked small, ordinary even, but the way the suspect stared at them, you'd think they were explosives. "First," Wolfe said, "Henry Felsen. His obsession is genuine. Miss Vane cast him aside 8 years ago, and he has carried that wound, literal and figurative, ever since. He supplied photographs, or was used to supply them. But Felsen is not clever enough to orchestrate this. He is a pawn. Is that not so, sir?" Felsen's voice cracked. "I never wanted this. I wanted her to remember me, not destroy her. I didn't send the envelopes. I swear." Wolfe inclined his head. "I believe you. You are weak, and weakness is easily exploited." He turned his gaze to Lyle. "You, sir, have resources. You received documents meant to link Felsen's ruin to Miss Vane's reputation. You intended to profit from her fall, but you did not design the fall itself. You are greedy, not imaginative, Lyle bristled. You can't prove that. Your reaction to the key betrayed you. You know what it opens, or at least fear that it exposes your stake. That folder was evidence, not artistry. You are guilty of avarice, not of authorship. Lyle's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Wolfe's eyes shifted to Harlan. Judge, you saw Felsen at the ball. You alone noted his scar. Why? Because you knew his face from your courtroom. You recognized an opportunity, but you are not the architect either. You weigh, you do not build. Your crime here is silence, not action. Harlan stiffened. I resent the implication. Resent all you wish, Wolfe said, dismissing him with a flick of his hand. Finally, Wolfe turned to Margot Channing. And you? You trespassed in my house. You rearranged my spices. That was theatre designed to provoke. You are vain, dramatic, and reckless. You would seize a chance to humiliate Miss Vane if it entertained you. But you lack precision. You crave audiences, not blueprints. You are a performer, not an architect. Channing surged to her feet. I won't sit here and be insulted. You will sit, Wolfe said, voice like a whip. And sit she did, though her face burned scarlet. The room was still again. All eyes turned towards Cecilia. She looked startled, then panicked, then almost furious. No, you can't mean... Yes, Wolfe said softly. It was you, Miss Vane. Her breath caught. Me? You orchestrated it all, Wolfe said. The envelopes, the tokens, the appearances. You feared exposure, yes, but you feared something more. Irrelevance. You revived Felsen, dangled him before us, directed Channing's vanity, exploited Lyle's greed, and leaned on Harlan's eye. You played them all, and why? To control your own ruin. Better to dictate the scandal than to
be consumed by it. The silence cracked like thunder. Cecilia's face drained of colour. That's insane. Why would I torment myself? To distract from the truth, Wolfe said. The key does not open a locker of Felsen's debts. It opens a deposit box you once used. Inside are letters, not from Felsen, but from a man whose name matters more, a man you wish never to be revealed. The campaign you staged was a misdirection. You let suspicion scatter among your circle, so that the true secret, the one you hold, would remain buried. But you miscalculated. You came to me, Cecilia's handbag slid from her lap to the floor with a dull thud. Her hands trembled. I only wanted to protect myself, she whispered. Indeed, Wolfe said. You sought to protect yourself by engineering confusion. But confusion is not protection, it is exposure. Tonight, your game ends. The room erupted, Channing shrieking denials, Lyle pounding his fist, Harlan sputtering, Felsen muttering broken pleas. Wolfe closed his eyes against the din and raised a hand. The noise died. Tomorrow, he said, the authorities will have the letters. Tonight, you will leave, all of you, and you will remember that Nero Wolfe is not to be trifled with. They filed out, shaken, some angry, some defeated. Cecilia lingered the longest, eyes hollow, but at last she too vanished into the snowy night. The brownstone returned to silence. Wolfe leaned back, exhaled, and reached for his beer. Archie, he said, remind me to have Fritz replace the paprika jar. I will not have my kitchen unsettled again. I grinned, lighting a cigarette. So that's it, huh? The blonde at the winter ball, undone by her own hand, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. Undone by her folly. Always folly. The clock ticked, the radiator hissed, and outside, the snow covered every trace of the night's storm. Inside, dinner was served, as always, and the brownstone was whole again. The brownstone never feels quieter than the morning after Wolfe has flattened a room full of suspects. It's not the kind of quiet you get from snow muffling the city. It's the kind that follows thunder, heavy and electric, like the air is still trying to remember the sound of the storm. Fritz moved carefully in the kitchen, his footsteps softer than usual, as though even he didn't want to disturb Wolfe's digestion of victory. I was at my desk, working through a stack of notes Wolfe had insisted I type up for the record, not for the police, not yet. That would come when he decided it suited him, but for his own satisfaction, a complete account of how Cecilia Vane had gone from society's darling to the architect of her own undoing. The phone rang just after 10. I picked it up and heard Inspector Kramer's gravel rolling down the line. "Goodwin, Wolfe around?" "He's vertical and in his chair, if that's what you mean." "Tell him I'm coming over. And tell him if this business with the blonde is as rotten as the papers make it sound, I expect him to be straight with me for once." I relayed the message. Wolfe's eyes barely opened. "He may come," he said, "but I will not be straight with him. I will be accurate. The distinction is important." Kramer arrived half an hour later, red-faced from the cold, hat jammed low, cigar clamped between his teeth. He stomped snow off his boots, glared at me, and pushed into the office like a man walking into a prize fight. "All right, Wolfe," he barked. "What's this about Cecilia Vane running her own blackmail show?" My men are tearing their hair, trying to figure out if she's a victim or a crook. "She is both," Wolfe said calmly. "But primarily the latter," Kramer grunted. "Explain." So Wolfe did, slowly, methodically, laying out how Cecilia had used Felson's obsession, Lyle's greed, Channing's vanity, and Harlan's perception to create a storm around herself, a storm she could control, until she made the mistake of dragging it into the brownstone. He explained the tokens, the photographs, the locket, the key, how each had been chosen not to reveal the past, but to distract from it, to spread suspicion outward while she clutched the real danger to her chest, the deposit box with letters inside, letters that tied her to a man whose name would scorch her reputation if it ever saw daylight. "And who's the man?" Kramer demanded. Wolfe's eyes closed. "Irrelevant. The authorities will have the letters. They may decide whether his identity merits exposure. What matters is Miss Vane's orchestration. She constructed her own labyrinth and then hired me to ensure she was not lost within it. Foolish. You cannot outwit yourself. You only reveal your own design." Kramer puffed furiously on his cigar. "So you're telling me the whole thing? Felson, the envelopes, even that damned paprika jar was smoke and mirrors?" "Her mirrors?" "Yes," Wolfe said, though the paprika was Miss Channing's embellishment. Vanity, not strategy. The core remained Miss Vane's. Kramer swore under his breath. "Society dames give me a burglar any day. At least he sticks to silverware." He jabbed a finger at Wolfe. "I'll need those letters." "You shall have them," Wolfe said, "in due course. For now, Miss Vane is contained. She will not flee. She has nowhere to flee." Kramer grumbled, but let it rest. He left smelling of cold air and frustration, and the brownstone breathed easier once the door shut. I leaned back in my chair, hands behind my head. "So that's it?" She built the whole thing herself. But what gets me is why. Why not just keep her secrets buried and pray Felson drank himself to death? "Because," Wolfe said, opening his eyes at last, "fear breeds folly." She believed if she could control the narrative, create diversions, sow suspicions, she could secure her safety. Instead, she ensured her exposure. It is the paradox of the desperate. In trying to conceal, they reveal. I nodded slowly. So Felson was just a puppet on strings, pulled by her own panic. Precisely. And panic is the most efficient puppeteer of all. Wolfe reached for his beer, poured it slowly, and took a measured sip. He closed his eyes again, signaling the conversation was over. That evening, the brownstone returned to its rhythm. Fritz served a roast with herb sauce, and Wolfe's appetite, dulled the past few days, returned in full. He carved with satisfaction, savouring each bite as if justice itself had been seasoned into the meat. After dinner, he leaned back, dabbed his lips, and delivered the final reflection I'd been waiting for. "Archie," he said, "remember this. A woman who fears her past may attempt to choreograph her ruin. But ruin cannot be choreographed. It arrives unsummoned, graceless, and absolute." "Only fools imagine otherwise," I grinned, lighting a cigarette. "And you, of course, get to play conductor when the orchestra collapses," Wolfe muttered. "I merely listen until the music betrays itself." The office fell into its familiar silence then, the radiator hissing, the clock ticking, the city muffled beneath its winter blanket. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering footprints, erasing traces, leaving only the brownstone standing firm against the storm. Inside, Nero Wolfe sat in his chair, content in the knowledge that folly had once again been dissected, measured, and put in its place. "And me?" I leaned back, smoke curling toward the ceiling, and thought about Cecilia Vane, the blonde at the winter ball, undone not by enemies, not even by Felsen, but by herself. Wolfe was right. It always comes down to folly.